My name is Chris Layton. I'm the director of the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies, and I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking Goucher College, and to extend a special thanks to all those who have made the celebrations of our 25th anniversary so memorable. The Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies is certainly on the move. We're launching new initiatives and expanding the scope of our mission, engaging new audiences and pressing difficult questions, as I trust this evening's program will demonstrate. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, a few words are in order to set the stage for this special program. As you know, a religious identity is not easily constructed. More often than not, religious identities are forged in the fires of conflict, and people discover their distinctive character by setting themselves in opposition to the surrounding culture. The contours of my group takes shape in adversarial encounters with others. An identity emerges when there is an us who stands in contrast to a them. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims have all too often defined theological boundaries and have all too often honed their own distinctiveness by rubbing up against their so-called competitors. Some argue that religions are hardwired for combat, and that this antagonistic disposition is especially pronounced among the world's monotheistic religions. That has been the dominant paradigm. The ICJS, however, is built on the hard-won conviction that Jews, Christians, and Muslims cannot afford to endlessly repeat the antagonisms of the past. We are poised to do something new, and we have something absolutely vital to learn from one another. We must develop the resources to disarm religious hate. Nothing less than our survival is at stake in this enterprise. In her remarkable new book on the Muslim question, Anne Norton cites the 14th century Muslim historiographer Ibn Khaldun, and according to Ibn Khaldun, people in hard places must have two virtues if they are to survive. They must have fortitude, and they must depend upon each other. In contrast to a good many Western philosophers who argue that politics is founded in enmity and is sustained by conflict, evidently a practice well established not too far from here in Washington, D.C., Ibn Khaldun insists that politics comes into being when people find that they can depend on one another. The community, the city, the nation has its roots in our aptitude for friendship. The same harsh circumstances that teach people strength and courage also teach them to trust. And our religious traditions have long understood that our social responsibilities emerge from the practice of hospitality, from the discipline of welcoming the stranger. And this habit of mind and heart is essential if we are to break the spell of distrust, ignorance, and hostility. There are few people in the Muslim community who have been on the forefront of this work to the extent that our speaker this evening has. Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf is the founder of the Cordova Initiative, a multinational, multi-faith organization dedicated to improving relations between Islam and the West. And he has been one of the most articulate and passionate advocates of a pluralistic, tolerant, and compassionate vision of Islam, bringing this message of moderation to audiences around the globe. With honors and awards too numerous to recite, he is a force of nature. In addition to his globe-trotting, he is the Imam of Al-Farah Mosque in New York and a productive author. So please join me in welcoming Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for this very warm welcome. Thank you, Dr. Christopher Layton, for having invited me and to the Institute of Christian Jewish Studies. It is indeed my honor to be here. I came to this country in 1965, and I've driven to Washington, D.C., where my parents were later transferred in 1970. It must be 100 times. Driven through Baltimore so many times, and I've always wondered a lot about it, but I've never enjoyed it as much as I have this evening. And in regard to your comment about moving our Congress from the inside Beltway 495 to Beltway 695, I think might be a helpful proposition to advance this country and the politics of our nation. Allow me to begin by telling a little bit of my own story. I was born in Kuwait of Egyptian parents. My father was a graduate of Al-Azhar University, which was then and still is regarded very highly as the preeminent Sunni, you might call it a seminary in the Muslim world. And he was sent to Kuwait to start an institute there of religious studies. So I was born in Kuwait, never lived there very long. When I was 18 months, my dad was transferred to England. And until the age of 6, I was in England, grew up on, fish and chips and malted vinegar, and grew up as a nice British boy, having ambitions of being the proverbial train driver, as every young boy at that time had ambitions of being. At the age of 6, my father was transferred to Malaysia, which was then a British colony, the Federation of Malaya, and I grew up in that multi-national, pluralistic society, composed of mainly Malays, who were predominantly Muslims, but also a very large Chinese minority and a much smaller Indian minority. And then I was just about 16 when I left Malaysia, but by then I already had issues of my own identity. When I came back to Egypt, after 11 months, my father was transferred to New York. So I came to this country in 1965, a young boy of 17, so you know how old I am, and went to Columbia University. So I was there during the time of, what is his name now? Mark Rudd, for those of you who are of my generation. And remember SDS and the riots of 1968 and Kent University. This was the height of the Cold War, the height of the Vietnam War, the time of Timothy Leary coming to, I would go into Ferris Booth Hall at Columbia University and you could see the smoke of marijuana. So unlike Bill Clinton, I didn't smoke, but you couldn't help inhaling the smoke because of its very thick presence in the auditorium. But during this period of time, especially when I was here, the issue of my identity became a very, very raw issue. And I began to introspectively look at who I am and what I was, and what defined me as what I was. And having grown up in different cultures, a part of me was distinctly, I was ethnically Arab Egyptian. I was culturally English in many ways, and especially growing up in a British colony. I was also Malay in many ways. I was Arab in certain ways. So, and yet, having grown up in cultures where there was a dominant culture and the urge to be able to peg myself or to hang my identity on some particular identity was something that I really couldn't figure out. And I also began to retrace my own life story and found that, from the age of 5 or 6, when I began to have the ambitions of being that train driver, I went through many ambitions. I wanted to be a musician, a singer, a film star, an actor, and then by the time of 14, a scientist. And then the age of just around that time, I realized that the question that was posed to me by, when I was a young boy, by my parents' friends, who says, "Hi, Feisal, what do you want to be when you grow up?" was actually rather wrong. And what they were asking me was, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And I then nuanced the difference between what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be. And while I still pursued the question of what I wanted to do professionally, the question of what do I want to be became a very much more intriguing question. A question that went into the very depths of what did it mean to be. And of course, at Columbia University, as even in high school, we used to have our friends, and we would stay up till the wee hours of the morning discussing the purpose of life. What are we here for? What's the purpose of my life, of your life? A question that I believe every human being at some point in his or her life seeks to address. And when I looked at the trajectory of my identity, or what it was that made me who I was, or the things that occupied my attention, and everything changed. My ambitions changed. My appearance changed. I looked at photographs of myself as an infant, as a baby, in different stages of my life. I could see that I looked different. And my emotions changed. When I was 6 years old, I was so upset when my teacher, whom I crushed on, got married. I thought, I felt jilted practically at the age of 6. And every couple of years, there'd be another girl whom I think, oh my God, if I don't get this woman, I'll die. And then 2 years later, I say, what was I thinking of? That's funny, but what wasn't so funny is when I committed myself to a woman and said, I'll love you for the rest of my life, and you wake up one morning, whether it's a few months later or a few years later, and I'm sure many of you here have had this experience, where you wake up one morning and you feel like somebody went into your heart and just vacuumed your feelings out completely. And you have no more feelings for this individual. No love, no hate, no feelings. And to feel that even one's own emotions, one's own passion, was not totally under my control. It was as if the Creator was playing a game with me and testing me as to how I would react to a change in the cards that I was dealt. But that had an impact upon how I defined who I was. I could not define myself by any one of these things, and therefore I had to redefine myself and reboot my identity. And the only way I could do that is through my religion. Through not even my religion as a Muslim, but my religion as a creature of the one God who created everybody, with whom I had a covenantal relationship to live a certain kind of life that was in obedience to the Creator's demands upon me. And when I defined myself at that place, I was able to relate to all of those who were my friends, because I had friends across the religious divides. I had friends who were Jews to whom I felt closer to many who were Muslims. I had friends who were agnostic or atheist to whom I felt a deeper love than those who were Muslims. Friends who were Christians to whom I felt a deeper attachment and deeper love than those who were Muslims, as well as Muslims to whom I have felt those sentiments. And so progressed the journey of my identity. But even as I went through that, I had more tests and more trials. And this has brought me to the journey of discussing the issues of identity that are very crucial and very important for many people, without which many people feel alienated. So I can relate to the issues of young men and young women, especially those who have come from immigrant societies, and most of you have come from immigrant societies at various stages in your or your ancestors' lives. But for us, the American Muslim community today, that consists of roughly 2/3, 1/3 immigrant Muslims and African American Muslims who have converted to Islam, this journey of who we are as American Muslims is an important one, and one that we are involved right now in trying to formulate, because it's not a constant thing. Neither do you arrive at a definition of who you are as an American Muslim community any more than you're an American Jewish community or an American Christian community or an American Roman Catholic community within the broader Christian community is something which is static. It's a constantly evolving thing. As I was sharing earlier with the group of eclectic scholars that Dr. Layton had me have dinner with, we discussed their respective and individual journeys, and many of the issues that were raised were issues that actually are the things that I've lived through and written about and talked about and thought through. But what is important for us today, and this is why I value the interfaith engagement and dialogue, is because we learn from each other. And this learning is not something which is new. You know, just like a young child who thinks that when he's discovered something, he was the first to discover it and doesn't realize it's been going on forever. We very often think that what we are discovering is something which never happened before. But the truth is, it has been going on all throughout human history. All throughout Islamic history, Muslims have engaged with non-Muslims. Even from before the time of the Prophet, during the time of the Prophet, and after the time of the Prophet, Muslims were engaged with non-Muslims. Muslims adopted many things from other cultures. Muslims tend to think that Islamic law, what we call Sharia, grew out of nothing. That's a myth. Islamic law grew out of the laws which were extant in those societies, not only in pre-Islamic Arabian society, in Egyptian society, in Mesopotamian society. They adopted the Roman law and many aspects of Roman law. The concept of the fatwa or a mufti is a concept taken from Roman law, where every town had a prudent. The Romans had every town a prudent, whom people would go to get their legal opinion on something. And so this became the mufti in Muslim communities. The dome, which many people associate with the mosque, and they think it's an Islamic feature, was something which Muslims adopted from the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul or Constantinople. The cathedral that was begun 30 years before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet's mosque had no dome. The first mosques had no domes. We adopted the dome, and now people think it's an Islamic feature, something we took from Christians. Even Christians don't think of it as Christian anymore. So this kind of borrowing and exchange of ideas, of culture, of views, points, or even of theological constructs was something that has been going on since the beginning of history. But we have, at certain phases and certain times of our journeys, a kind of a collective amnesia of these things. And part of the role of education, part of the role of interfaith dialogue and education, is to remind ourselves of the richness and the wealth of our own cultures. And this is part of why it's important for us in this day and this age and to engage in these issues of importance, because Islam has become today one of the most important questions to deal with. And the perceptions of Americans about Islam has been shaped as much by events as by the writings of influential people. In my opinion, it's no accident that when Samuel Huntington wrote his Clash of Civilizations and identified Islam and Muslims as the next existential enemy of the Western civilization, that he helped create the reality. Because unlike dealing with inanimate objects, we human beings react to how we are viewed. when men treat women as inferior, you'll create gender conflicts. So part of the issue is to change the dynamic on both sides. If you teach a people that people who are of different color than you are inferior to you, you will create that reality. And that's the battle that we're facing today. The battle today is not between Islam or Islamic theology and Western civilization. It is not between Muslims and Christians. It is not between Muslims and Jews or Muslims and Hindus. Although there is an element to that that is true, but that is not the whole truth. And it lacks a very important component of the truth. Because when you look at the nature of conflict and how conflict arises, it arises basically, and I'm going to give you a mini lecture here on what I call the physics of conflict. It starts when two people or two parties or two individuals fight over something. And the thing that they fight about is something which they each value. So two guys can fight for the love of a woman. We've seen that a lot. But bigger conflicts happen when two parties, two groups, fight over something. It can be ideology. It usually is ideology or beliefs, or something of political power, value, or material value. And then what happens is the language gets more extreme, the actions get more extreme, like two guys, first shouting at each other, then one starts pushing the other, the guy pushes back, and before you have it, this tit for tat results in physical violence. And it can happen between any two groups. It can happen on the basis of skin coloring, like what happened in America, between whites and blacks in America. It can happen between people of different tribes, like Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. It can happen between people of different religious groups, like Muslims and Jews in Israel, Palestine. It can happen between sects within a particular religious community, like between the Sunni and Shia in Bahrain or in Syria, or like what happened in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics. But if you look, and what happens once the conflict generates and lasts, people begin to rationalize it. And you'll have books being written about the superiority of the white man over the black man, or the superiority of men over women, or the real difference which explains this conflict as coming from, and people and scholars will write about it. But in my opinion, it's not really there. It's about, you have to look. In the case of Israel-Palestine, it's about the land and how the land became seen as belonging to the Jews and not to the Arabs who are living on it. And that was the start of that conflict. So trying to go back to the time of Ishmael and Isaac and saying this conflict has begun then is, in my opinion, an error of analysis. The troubles in Ireland had nothing to do with Protestant Catholic ideology. It has to do with a group identity, where the Irish Catholics perceived that they didn't have parity with the Irish Protestants on the economic and political power pie. This is the same issue in Bahrain and in Syria. In Syria, you have an Alawite minority. That's a branch of the Shia community, which is ruling very, very heavy-handedly over a Sunni majority. In Bahrain, you have the opposite, a Sunni minority ruling over a Shia majority, which explains why the Iranians who are Shia are supportive of their Shia fellow Shia in Syria and in Bahrain, which is why the American Catholic community was sympathetic to the Irish Catholics and was sustaining them until 9/11. So, but the challenge is then how do you reframe the discourse while you recognize that the discourse and the conflict has been shaped around these issues, how do you then change the discourse to recognize that there is an important aspect which really is the cycle of violence, which is sustained by the agencies or the agents who perform those actions and against the vast majority of the people. And therefore, I have chosen to reframe this discourse as a battle, not so much between one side and the other, but between the moderates of all religions against the extremists of all religions. Because if you look again at the dynamics of conflict, the heavy-handed approach or the extremist approach fuels a self-sustaining vicious circle. So you have a mullah in Iran says death to America. Americans see this and say, this is scary stuff. Look at these crazies. And if somebody then from America will say, look at these crazy Muslims. A general or some military person will say, we're in Iraq because we want, there's a war against, a crusade against Islam. This becomes a banner headline in the Muslim world, so some Muslim person, says something bad against America. And then you have a priest in Florida who threatens to burn the Quran and burns the Quran. That becomes a headline thing in the Muslim world. And in Afghanistan, they kill 6 European workers, because of the acts of this parish priest in Florida who had a barely existent congregation. So you see how the cycle feels on itself. The extremists grab the headlines, they grab the news, and many people want to be famous, have the 15 minutes of fame, and drawn to that, and they become heroes. And you can have these dynamics of extremism work in any given space. In fact, you can even argue coherently that what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now is an expression of this kind of extremism, where the extremists within the right wing of the Republican Party have basically edged out the moderates in the Republican Party. The discourse polarizes the middle, evacuates the middle. So while you can look at the argument today, or the discourse in Washington, D.C. as between Republicans and Democrats, there's also a value in looking at the discourse between the need for the moderates of both parties to combat the extremists of both parties, because it's the moderates that create workable government in the United States. It's when moderate Republicans sit with moderate Democrats that government works. When the polarization reaches the point where the moderates are completely removed, then you have gridlock, and now we have a situation where, as we speak, our government is shut down, with potentially disastrous effects, not only for the United States, but for the whole world. In a certain sense, this microcosm of what's happened in Washington, D.C. has been happening in the Muslim world for the last 40 years, where extremist ideology, more fundamentalist ideology, has been edging out the moderates in the Muslim world. And therefore the fight within the Muslim world today is between the moderates and the extremists. But in this battle, moderate Muslims, while they have to be part of the fight, an important part of the fight, need the help of moderate Christians and moderate Jews, especially in the areas of conflict where those faith communities are also parties to the particular conflict. So this is the part of the work that I do, in which we talk about these things, but not only talk about these things. And what I've started a little over 10 years ago with the Cordoba Initiative was to do what I call not only a think tank that thinks about these issues, but a do tank that creates specific projects and programs to address these issues. One of the issues in the Muslim world for the last almost a century, with the rise of nation states, as nation states were being carved out of the previous Ottoman Empire and even the India, there has been a rise of some instances of states which have called themselves Islamic states, like Pakistan, and there are political parties throughout the Muslim world who have the ambition to establish an Islamic state. And yet, there's no coherent definition on this. This issue has become so contentious, so fractious an issue, that has caused problems in Iran, in Pakistan, And even in countries like Egypt and Tunisia today, there's a deep divide in those societies among the supporters of something called an Islamic state, which has not been coherently defined, and what a secular state. So this project which we have done, I brought jurists together from different parts of the Muslim world, Sunni, Shia, different major countries, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, etc. Asked them to define what an Islamic state means with the intention of developing methodology to measure such an animal and to rate countries as to how they comply with this definition. The methodology of rating has been very challenging, but the jurisprudence was the easier part, and now we're looking to actually publish this work because many friends of mine have viewed this as very valuable in bridging the ideological divide in those nations. In fact, I went to Egypt in August to present this jurisprudence to the interim government as a means of bridging the ideological divide. Of course, it doesn't bridge the political divide, but if you can at least arrive at some kind of an ideological, philosophical agreement between these two sides, you have at least carved out or removed one very important aspect of what has been fueling conflict in those countries. That's an example of the kind of work we do. We have another project on women's empowerment in the Muslim world and on educating Muslims in many countries about the rights of women and certain wrong practices that have been done in many Muslim-majority countries to women, such as what's called today FGM, female genital mutilation, or female circumcision, which had nothing to do with our religion, never part of our religion, but which has become interpreted in some Muslim countries, especially African Muslim countries like Egypt and Somalia, as being an Islamic practice. So that's the kind of work we do. So it's more than just the academic analysis, but applying these analyses to be what I call activists in the real world to bring about a better world. So again, thank you very much for bearing with me. I think I've covered my half an hour, and I look forward to our conversation and your questions. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Islam in the United States and in much of Europe has been subjected to very sharp criticism. And as we know, many politicians have pandered to their constituencies by assailing Islam. And we know that lawmakers in at least 32 states have introduced bills to restrict the circumstances in which state courts can consider foreign or religious laws in their decisions. And of course, these proposals are more often than not veiled and not so well veiled anti-Sharia policies that are being advocated. So I'd like to, if we could take a little bit of time to explore what animates the fear of these advocates. And to do that, first of all, by talking just very briefly about what is Sharia and what is about what's going on in our culture that provokes such strong reactions to Sharia.
Yes, and in part, this question has to do again with the discourse between the extremists on both sides. You'll find extremists on the Muslim side saying we want to plant the Islamic flag on the White House, bring Sharia to America, which arouses the fears of the other side. That apart, I think the fear of Sharia is the sense when Americans think of Sharia, they think of the penal code, stoning of women in particular and chopping off of hands. Which hasn't been applied in most Muslim countries, and the few countries that have applied, like the Taliban, are not indicative of what the vast majority of Muslim countries have done. Apart from the penal code, the Sharia is nothing more than God's commandments. So when God commands us to love God and love your neighbor, when God commands us, thou shalt, the 10 commandments, thou shalt not take the name of your Lord in vain, thou shalt honor thy parents, thou shalt not steal, not kill, not slander, not commit adultery. These are all parts of our law. Our dietary code, our dietary laws, like, the Jews have their dietary laws. We have our dietary laws. That's part of our law, part of our Sharia. The way we bury our dead, the way we perform our prayers is part of our law. The way we dispense with our properties in estate law is part of our law. So apart from the penal code, there's nothing in Sharia law that is really antithetical to American law. But part of the work that we have to do as Muslims is to engage in this process and also define what we mean by Muslims, by an American Islam. When I talk about an American Islamic identity, this is again to advance the same thing that has happened to not only Islam in its history, but to Christianity and Judaism. Because as Christianity went from Palestine, where Jesus Christ was born and lived, to Egypt, you had the Coptic Church, the Egyptian Church. When it went to Syria, to Greece, to Russia, you have the three different branches of the Orthodox Church, Syrian, Greek, and Orthodox, named by their national identities. When Constantine finally decided to become Christian, it became the Roman Catholic Church. And as Christianity moved more north to Europe, you had even different churches, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Anglican Church in England, the Scottish, I think, Presbyterian Church, and the American churches. That process is not only a natural phenomenon of religion, where religion expresses itself in the constructs of that particular society. When that happens, people in that country think of that religion as being native to that country. Italians don't think of Christianity as a Palestinian religion. They think of it as an Italian religion. Southern Baptists think of Christianity as an American religion, not even a European religion. And the same thing with Muslims. When Islam spread to different countries, it expressed itself in the law, the jurisprudence, the culture, the architecture, the musical traditions of that particular country. And what we need to do here in America is to recreate or re-express Islam in American constructs of law and jurisprudence, American dress culture, cultural codes, in American architecture. I don't believe a mosque in the United States should look like a transplant from 13th century Turkey. I think it should look American. Because when that happens, because that's part of our own history. The Mughal architecture in India was Indian architecture. The Qawwali music of South Asia, which is a religious music of Islamic religious songs, has a uniquely Indian sound to it, very different from Arabic religious songs or Turkish religious songs, which sound like Orthodox singing, actually. Christian Orthodox chants have the same musical intonations. Therefore, I believe that this is why I say in my writings that we have to evolve from being Muslims in America to becoming American Muslims. But the task of shaping that is something which is a work in progress. It is happening right now. We're a cross-section of the whole. Immigrants here are not from part of the Muslim world. We're from all over the Muslim world. And how we need to integrate that with our African-American Muslim brothers and sisters, and also the broader complexion of Islam and demographic of Islam in the society, is part of the work that we have ahead of us here in America. And an important part of it is law, is jurisprudence. And I have some writings on that I don't need to go into right now, but that I think is a very important part of our work.
Thank you. So not too long ago, I spent some time with a Christian theologian from Sri Lanka who was involved in an interfaith conversation with some Hindu scholars. And one Hindu scholar turned to this Christian theologian and said, what I'd like you to consider and respond to is the following. Why do you as a Christian need to have a Hindu at the table? what would be missing from the conversation, what would be missing from your own understanding of the world were we not here. So my question to you is, why do Muslims need to have Christians and Jews at the table? What would be missing? What is it that Muslims really have to learn that's not just of cultural and political significance, which is to say, not just that we get along better, but are there theological and spiritual reasons why Muslims would need to be in conversation with Christians and Jews?
What did the Hindu say?
The Hindu raised the question. It was up to the Christian to respond. The Christians, well, I don't want to give his answer until you've had a chance to respond.
That's not fair. Well, we believe as Muslims that the Quran teaches us that God taught his teachings and his commandments to every community in the world. There's not a single community, the Quran says, where God says in the Quran, to whom I did not send a messenger, a prophet, to teach them. The thing is that Muslims don't practice that. They read that, but they haven't assimilated that statement into their practice. And I believe that by engaging with people of other faiths, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Shintos, you name it, is how I personally and how we get to understand how this happened in our human history. Because if I can use the term Quranic history to refer to what God says in the Quran he has done to all of humankind, then part of the assignment that I have is to understand that and to understand how that played. And then secondly, to understand how the criticisms that we have of other faiths apply to our own tradition. Because Muslims have a myth that their faith has remained unchanged since the time of the Prophet. While by and large it is true as far as our fundamental core beliefs and our rituals, on many other levels it is not true. The schools of jurisprudence that we practice did not exist then, at the time of the Prophet. Even the way we name ourselves has changed. At the time of the Prophet, the Quran always addresses the Prophet's followers as believers. It says, O you who have believed, O you believers, tell the believing men and the believing women to do this, to do that. Never once does God in the Quran call the Prophet's followers Muslims. He says, I named you Muslims, but he never addresses them by that terminology. And I remember asking many people, when did we start calling ourselves Muslims? But we don't think of those issues. So this is things, and how those things have changed, because if we can just think, I was talking to you earlier about how language imprisons us and how language divides us. I mean, I'm told, I don't speak Inuit, that the Eskimos don't have one word which means snow, because they have winter snow, spring snow, wet snow, dry snow, light, or varieties of snow. So that they don't see snow as just one thing. They see it as many things, different kinds of snow. So instead of calling ourselves believers, we call ourselves Christians and Jews and Muslims and so forth. I mean, Jesus never called himself a Christian. One of the stories that I remember seeing on a documentary was this gentleman who was studying at, I think, Union Theological Seminary. and went back to Christmas to his mother in the south and said, you know, Ma, Jesus was a Jew. She says, what nonsense are they teaching you up there, up north in that seminary? Of course Jesus was a Christian. We laugh at that. But when did the followers of Jesus Christ think of themselves as not an offshoot or a branch or a revival of Judaism and thought of themselves as Christians, as a separate religion? Now that marks a differentiation in the sense of identity and group identity and religious identity. The prophet came to revitalize the Abrahamic faith tradition. And in his initial interactions with the Jews, who were the dominant tribes there were not many Christians in Arabia, he came with that attitude and that approach. So by being able to actually study with each other our respective histories, we can unlearn certain myths that we have and see through the limitations of language. Because language is a grid by which we break and divide reality. And to the extent that that grid operates both in our religious spaces has an enormous impact about how we see ourselves and how we see the others and how we engage with them. But by being able to go through the grid, beyond the grid, the whole purpose of the spiritual path, in my case the Sufi path, is to go beyond the limitations of language, to go to the reality of the thing itself. So you don't get stuck in the term love or amour or hub, but you go to the experience of love itself, because when you experience the love of God, you go beyond the limitations of language. And for any person who's an adherent of any religion, who is stuck at the level of language, is stuck at the level of rituals. But the whole purpose of the religious imperative is to give you a glimpse of the reality of God. And anyone and everyone, through any tradition, and of no tradition, who is given that serendipitous act of divine grace, and I'm sure most of you have had such an experience in your lives. Could be in a dream, could have been awake, where you had a vision, a moment when the boundaries of your consciousness dissolved and you knew that you're in the presence of the Almighty Creator. It is that experience which we all have to go to. And the religious crystallizations are the attempts to capture those moments in certain ritualistic moments so we can remember that and make that a point of communion, which is the basis of community. I think that is where interfaith interaction is most important and why it's invaluable for us to learn this. It also relates to our understanding of our own individual histories, of individual religious traditions, but also to recognize the different methods of a different tradition. I don't know how many of you have read the writings of Fritjof Schuon, S-C-H-U-O-N, a brilliant thinker and writer of religious spirituality, who wrote tremendous insights about Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism. He speaks about spiritual perspectives in a way that takes you into the fundamental reality of what religion and spirituality is all about, and reminds us that it's about enacting and reenacting our commitment to the Creator and how we are able to truly love God and via loving God, love neighbor.
So my Sri Lankan theologian friend responded to the Hindu by saying, I need you to rattle me out of my complacency. And what I encounter when I encounter you is somebody that I don't understand, and somebody who therefore embodies something of the mystery of the world that needs to be unraveled. And unraveling the mystery of how I understand you and come to know you, I also have the encounter with the divine. So the need is as fundamental to him, he said, as the air he breathes. We belong to scriptural traditions that have lots of problems. There are texts within the Bible, of course, that exhort us to respond to enemies, to at times be abusive with respect to women, violent with respect to those with whom we enter into sharp disagreement and with whom we may classify as idolaters or what have you. And one of the things we've really wrestled with at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies has been how do you disarm? How do you defang? How do you handle texts that spin out of control and sanction some really dreadful behavior? So my question is, within the sacred writings of Islam, there are ideologues who pull texts out and use them for insidious ends. How do you mobilize a community so that it disarms and defangs those abusive uses of texts?
That's a great question and an important question. Unfortunately, what has happened in our faith tradition is that whereas until the mid-20th century, most people who were considered authorities on Islam had to go through a course of study, where we have a heritage of jurisprudence, of Quranic exegesis, of interpretation of our texts, which has resulted in certain well-established interpretations. What has happened in the last 50, 60, 70 years with the advancement of literacy is that vast numbers read the Quran directly and believe that they are qualified to interpret these scriptures and these texts. That's just like a person like me studying the statutes of law and making legal judgments or legal decisions on what this statute should mean. And I remember having the discussion with one of our lawyers once when I worked for a company. He said, the law says, Faisal, you're going to lose in a court. That's not the way the court will interpret it, because there is a body of precedents, of jurisprudence that has decided this particular issue in such a way. Similarly, we have a very well-developed juristic tradition which has been ignored by many of these young people right now, like the Bin Ladens of the world and the Anwar al-Awlakis of the world, who believe that because they can read something and because they have a relatively high IQ, that they're qualified to render their opinions. This has been the big cause of that. So what we have to do really is to combat that. One of the ways of combating that is also by building relationships, personal relationships with people. When you get to know somebody, if you're a Muslim and you get to know Christians, get to know Jews. I didn't know Jews until I came to this country, really, because in Malaysia we hardly had any Jews. And when you don't know people, you have this strange imagery of them. But once you get to know them and you have friendships and loving relationships and business relationships, that really helps make all the difference in the world. And then you kind of like put aside what the beliefs are. I mean, the Egyptians have lived with Jews, with Copts for centuries. It wasn't until recently that the problems began. And that's what's important. Those relationships make a big difference. An important study which proved this was a study by an Indian sociologist who studied Hindu-Muslim violence in India. And he discovered that Hindu-Muslim violence only occurred in urban contexts, never in suburban contexts. And it occurred in some cities, but not in others where the same demographics existed. So we decided to study why. And his conclusions were because in those cities and in the suburban areas, Hindus and Muslims had personal relationships. And he broke them into two categories, the social relationships and the professional relationships, which were even more important. So in those cities where there was no Hindu-Muslim violence, Hindus and Muslims were business partners. They were members of the same professional clubs. They were members of the same political parties. And therefore, whenever the stimulus for violence would occur, because they were the people who were running the city councils and all of that, they were able to suppress it from occurring. Whereas in those cities where those relationships were absent, the stimulus to violence would result in a lot of violence between Hindus and Muslims, which would again keep the cycle of extremism and violence continuing. So the lesson from that is build relationships, build professional relationships. This is why in olden cultures, when people had war, they would marry the daughter of one king to the sister or the son of the other king as a means of building peace. So in today's situation, maybe like, Netanyahu's daughter marrying, the son of, some Palestinian ruler, and that's how you build those kinds of relationships. There's personal relationships of that kind, marriage relationships, friendships, business partnerships. This is how you build, I think, the kind of counteractive forces to the forces that want to enhance violence.
Well, we'll have to send Netanyahu a suggestion as to how peace can be brought to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
I think in this case, Iran. And Iranian women are rather beautiful, I must add.
You wrote a very intriguing and important op-ed piece that was published in the Baltimore Sun, in which you maintain that religion is oftentimes the neglected force within statescraft, that there is going to be no peace in the world if there is not peace between our religious traditions, as Hans Kung said. And too oftentimes, religious leaders are left out of the equation. I want to press that question a little bit. Who do you get to the table? Who do you bring to the table? Do you limit the religious leadership to the category you described as religious moderates? Or do you bring moderates and extremists? And how do you prevent an overlay of religious conflict from simply compounding the political wrangling? So, in principle, I'm in 100% agreement that religion needs to be factored into the equation. It's the practicality and the problematic character of how you actually go about the business of including and selecting and figuring out how religious leaders can actually play a constructive role rather than one that simply adds fuel to the fire.
That's an excellent and very important question, and there's no one magic answer for that. The points I was making were as follows. First of all, America cannot have a coherent policy versus many Muslim countries if it does not understand the role of religion that is played in those societies. So if you want to have an understanding on how, a coherent foreign policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis Iran, and until recently we had this idea of separation of church and state meant we wouldn't even talk about religion. You have to understand the role of religion in those societies. If you want, Rabbi David Rosen, a close friend of mine, said the reason why Oslo 1993 did not work is because it was the secular leaders only who were involved, and the religious leaders were not included as part of the Oslo discussions. And you need the buy-in of those religious groups, because in that particular context, those religious groups have a vested interest. They are part of the stakeholders. Now, when you want to resolve a conflict, you have to bring all the players of the conflict. So let's say in Egypt, you want to resolve the question in Egypt. Well, who are the stakeholders? You can't just have a situation like what the Muslim Brotherhood did, where it won 51.7% of the vote and ramrodded its philosophy on the rest of the population. This is what our founding fathers wrote about in the Federalist Papers when they warned against the tyranny of the majority. And what we've seen is a tyranny of those who are in power against the other. And now the interim government, unfortunately, is doing the same thing. Now, if you want to resolve the conflict in Egypt, you have to bring all the stakeholders to the table. And you have to identify the different stakeholders. So you have the Muslim Brotherhood. You have those who believe in the idea of an Islamic state. Bring them to the table. You have the other side. Bring them to the table. You have the military. Bring them to the table. You have the, what I call, the Mubarak institutionalized individuals, people who benefited from the Mubarak regime, be they business people who benefited, and when the revolution happened, were afraid, so they fled with their billions of dollars, creating capital flight out of Egypt, which has resulted in a decline of the economy. So you have to reconcile. We need a national reconciliation, like what happened in South Africa, between the new regime and the old people who benefited from the old regime. So you have to bring all the different stakeholders together and let them they have to be bought into the roadmap of how the future will be built. So in the context of Israel-Palestine, you need representatives of the three religious traditions. And to the extent that religious assets, quote unquote, are involved, that has to be also involved, because part of the issue in the case of Israel-Palestine is the religious sites and who controls the religious sites. That has to be thrashed out, and you can't thrash it out unless Muslim leaders are involved regarding the Dome of the Rock, Jewish leaders are involved regarding, the Wailing Wall and other Jewish holy sites, Christian leaders are brought in regarding Christian sites. And I mean, you have to bring them together, and these things have to be worked through. So in each context, in the political context, you have to bring in all the stakeholders. And take Syria, for example, you need also external stakeholders, because you have Iran that is a player, you have Hezbollah that's a player, and if they're not involved in the resolution, they will upset it, guaranteed. They will make sure that your solution will not work. But I think that's pretty obvious.
I want to turn to some of the questions that you all have posed. There are a few questions that cluster around the role of the African American community, and particularly the shape of African American Islam, the role that Malcolm X played, the role that other key leaders, Wallace D. Muhammad and others, they have a distinctive way of drawing upon this history and giving shape to Islam. How can that movement inform the larger reality of Islam? What impact, what contribution do you think the African American Muslim movement has to contribute?
That's a very important question. The African American Muslims, by and large, became Muslims in part as a rejection of the white man's religion, which was imposed upon them, in part because many of them felt that this was their original religion, because it is documented that tens of thousands of those who were brought as slaves from West Africa were Muslims. And anybody who read Alex Haley's Roots and saw the TV series where he traced his ancestry to a Muslim family in Mali re-emphasized the avataric connection that many African Americans felt with Islam. But this also defines a bit of the different vector between the African American Muslims and the immigrant Muslims. The African American Muslims turned to Islam at a time which coincided with the civil rights movement, the attempt to express themselves as an African American people, as a rejection of American values, whereas by and large the American immigrant community came to America to flee from their countries or, for one reason or another, to buy into the American dream. And this, in my judgment, defines the fundamental cleavage between the African American Muslim community, or the ethos of the African American Muslim community, with the immigrant Muslim community. But I see it eventually converging, because from those of my African American brothers who tell me, oh, their children don't appreciate what we went through during the civil rights movement, they're taking their rights for granted. So what's happening generationally is, I think, gives me more hope that these vectors will coalesce, and they have been coalescing. Now that we have people like, Keith Ellison, who's the first Muslim congressman from Minnesota, and we have, I think, one or two others who are Muslim members of Congress, and we shall see this expanding, no doubt. And it's important because, as I have also pointed out, the American Muslim community is and will be an important interlocutor between the country that we love and the faith community that we love all over the world. Just as the American Jewish community was critical for the establishment of the State of Israel. Israel would not have existed if not for the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community has been a major interlocutor between America and the global Jewry. The American Catholic bishops were instrumental in bringing about Vatican II and convincing the Vatican to move away from their belief in non-separation of church and state. And there's no doubt in my mind that American Muslims have played an important role in bringing democracy and advancing democracy in their homelands. It is no accident that the current foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, studied and lived many years in the United States of America. And therefore the experience of not only having lived in America, but also American Muslims, therefore, I think is a very important and undervalued role in being effective and important interlocutors on this issue. We still have a way to go, but I think it's important for us, because as more Muslims become members of Congress, as more Muslims become involved in helping and be mediators, for lack of a better word, between our country and the Muslim world, I think we'll have a more nuanced and more effective foreign policy.
Here's a question that wants to know how you think we can encourage all religious moderates, the great silent majority, to speak up. Specifically, the questions about how does one mobilize nonviolence, as you've been a very outspoken advocate of nonviolence in Islam. What actions can be taken to disseminate that vision? And what are the forums to, I'm reading here, to counter Fox News?
Moderation doesn't get ratings. Fox News has higher ratings than CNN and MSNBC. It's more exciting to see people fight. I remember I'm blanking on his name now, the ex-head of the CIA was telling me, Imam Feisal, people love to see a fight. People love to watch a fight. And it draws more ratings. I mean, friends of mine have told me, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead in the news. News is not about good things happening, it's about bad things happening. So I don't know the answer, but what I have done is I have been a factor in starting a new entity called the Global Movement of Moderates, which is an attempt to rally around us a group of people who will champion moderation. We have in mind to define it both from the religious tradition philosophically, from Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, to the way of the moderate way in Confucianism and Buddhism, to the concept of wasatiyya in Islamic theology. So to look at it from a theological and philosophical point of view, to define it operationally in terms of how do we moderate conflicts, how do we apply the brakes on these cycles of conflicts in different spaces, be they religious, economic, political. Because we can argue that the economic meltdown of 2008 was a case of greed, lack of moderation, or the failure of moderation in the economic or financial sphere. So we need to define it philosophically, religiously, to define specific instances where we can put together teams of moderates to actually intervene in real time, such as like what I'm trying to do in Egypt today, to eliminate or to reduce this cycle which I see of heavy-handedness, which will only create more problems, fracture the societies even more, to seeing, and we need a very special team right now in Washington, D.C., to bring back, to strengthen the voices of Republican moderates against Republican extremists if we are to save our country. So it requires developing special teams, and pardon my using of football language, to target specific spaces where you can bring about sufficient force to bear, and then to identify the players. It's like putting together a football franchise. You want to put a football team together, you need a great coach, you need a great quarterback, and you need to put together players, and you have to craft plays in real time on the field to get your first downs. You have to identify the people who are opposing you, who will look to oppose you, and you have to figure out how you're going to block them, how you're going to pass the ball around them. It's that kind of analysis. It's as complicated or as uncomplicated as coaching a football team, except in these spaces. So that's kind of the work that the new project which we have just come up. We have just incorporated this new entity on September 9th, and we're looking forward to having your support in any and all ways. Thank you very much.
So we have a question taking note of the fact that the New York Times recently commented on the slippage of American Jews away from their tradition in the direction assimilating into the culture and falling into that category of nuns, N-O-N-E-S-S, people who do not check any box for organized religion. And we see a similar phenomena happening amongst many Christians who in this culture are giving up on organized religion and no longer find the rituals and traditions speak to them. Is there a similar problem with assimilation or challenge with assimilation of young Muslim girls and boys or young men and women within Islam?
I'm sure there are instances of that. I've heard of atheism rising in Egypt. But right now, our bigger challenge seems to be the opposite. It seems to be the rise of extremism. I was just interviewed today by a journalist from writing a book on Anwar al-Awlaki and trying to figure out how this US-born person became an extremist. So I think the greater battle that we are having in the Muslim community today is dealing with those who are having problems of identity and having greater difficulties assimilating and creating this problem for us. I think another thing that differentiates Muslims is that from the point of view of our faith, what defines us as Muslims is very clear. A belief in God, practicing our rituals, so it's pretty clear and very specific. I have had discussions with Jewish friends of mine, and the Jewish identity is kind of more difficult to wrap your head around. It both has an ethnic cultural dimension, and it also has a religious dimension, but as a Jew, you don't have to believe in, you can actually disbelieve in almost anything and still be regarded as Jewish. So the Jewish identity seems to me, from my perspective, to be you're Jewish in spite of what you believe rather than because of what you believe. And for Muslims, and therefore the culture becomes an important part of it. Whereas for Muslims, if you believe in these things, you're a Muslim, period. Being a Muslim just is, if you believe in the oneness of God, and if you believe that Muhammad is messenger of God, you're a Muslim, plain and simple. And half the time, just if you say after me, I bear witness that there's no God but God, and I witness that Muhammad is messenger of God, you're a Muslim, right there. So the identification of being Muslim is very simple. Of course, you may question, there are Muslims who don't practice, there are Muslims who, practice once a year, like we have, they come to the Eid prayers or only on Fridays. So I think that phenomenon exists throughout. But our challenge is more of a community that has not yet assimilated and is looking to assimilate itself in the fabric of American society.
Here's a question that asks you to single out one thing within your tradition that you find particularly beautiful and moving.
I love that question. And I love the person who asked that question. Whoever he or she is, I'd like to meet that person. I think for me, the thing that is most appealing about Islam is its spiritual power. I am a practicing Sufi. Our meditation is extremely effective and very powerful, and it draws you into that space where you are able to taste the reality of the Creator, and its simplicity. And it's no accident that, for better or worse, whenever the media covers Muslims, they cover us at the moment of prayer when we're going into prostration or to bowing, because it's visually very arresting. And for those of you who may not know, we believe that the Prophet was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then he ascended to heaven, where he saw the angels praying in those positions. At one level, the angels were all lined up in a row, standing, hymning God's praises. At the next level, they were eternally in the bowing state, and then the next level, eternally in the prostration state. And the Prophet so loved this visual imagery that it became the choreography of our prayer. So when we are praying, we're actually recapitulating, or we are evoking the choreography of the angels as they hymn and worship the Creator. And therefore our faith is a faith which actually invites us to participate with the angelic realm in the worshiping of the one God. And to me, I think the choreography of my faith, the power of my faith in answering the questions, in leading me to the Creator, in providing me with an existential worldview which doesn't have contradictions, at least from my standpoint, is to me the most beautiful part of my faith. And the fact that it bonds us to each other. I can go and pray in a mosque anywhere in the Muslim world, and I stand next to somebody who may have very different political view from mine, and yet we are bonded together in a sense of community that overcomes our ethnic divisions, our political variations, is something very, very powerful. And the language which Jesus uses of the church being the body of Christ, or one of, was it Roseanne, I think, who was telling me just now that her professor said that the church is not the magisterium, but the people, the Christian people at large, as we say, the Christian ummah, the Muslim ummah. So the notion of a community that represents God in some way is, I think, important. God says in the Quran, we have created you as a Khalifa, which means as a vicegerent. But this idea means that each one of us is created in the image of God in some way. So each of us has in himself or herself, we are all like broken mirrors in which God sees itself. And the imagery in Sufism of polishing our mirror so that that divinity sees itself clearly and without any distortion is part of the religious process. And that imagery of faith, I think, is something which my religion contributes, but also shares with our fellow Christians and Jews, and also, I believe, our brothers and sisters of the other faith traditions as well, Buddhists and Hindus, and who believe in the ability of the human being to connect with God. And when you do connect with God, you become a channel for the divine will, which is what the aspirant always aspires to. But I found it, I was fortunate to find it in my faith tradition, and I have been fortunate in being able to share this with those of my students and congregation. Thank you for that beautiful question.
There is important work to do, and it needs to be taking place on several levels to make sure that the voices of moderation can be heard and echo far and wide. And we look forward to working with you and with others, and encourage any of you who would like to be alerted to various programs that our institute is conducting to make sure to sign that card and turn it in, and that way we can email you news alerts of various things that are going on. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and we hope to see you soon again. Godspeed.